"You'll meet her tonight," he said, smiling in that slow, almost ceremonial way he had reserved for small rituals, cutting the crusts from his toast, tucking a napkin into his collar, winding the old clock in the hallway at the same minute each evening. The words were ordinary, a domestic promise, the sort of sentence that could belong to a dozen different nights in a dozen different lives. Still, when he said them, the room moved 3 degrees off its axis for me. We had been married 32 years then. 32 years of small convergences, calendars matched, keys left in the same bowl, glasses that had developed faint circular clouds, where our breath had warmed them one winter. He had the habit of announcing small events like they were gifts. "We're out of sugar," he would say with an air of ceremony. Or, "Mrs. Barnaby set up her tomatoes," as if the world needed the punctuation of his observation. That night, though, his voice carried something I could not name. It sat in the space between the cutlery and the steam of tea, and I found myself listening to it, as if it were a bell. "I'm meeting someone?" I asked, because the simplest responses feel like anchors in moments when the floor might tilt. He nodded with the mild gravity of a man handing me the last of something important. "Yes, you'll see. She's been part of my life for a long time." He said the words like a man offering a cup of tea. I received the sentence like a pebble dropped into the pond of our ordinary night, small ripples radiating out, enough to rewrite the reflections on the surface. The lamp's soft halo, the photograph of us at the lake, where he'd insisted I smile with my eyes wide open. He reached out and smoothed a crease on my sleeve, an old kindness. I could have taken that gesture for comfort. Instead, it felt like a rehearsed farewell. We ate in silence after that. Not the tetchy, sharp silence couples fall into when the small things are suddenly barbed. This silence was heavy and precise, like the hush that comes right after the gardener closes the gate at dusk and everything in the yard holds its breath. I watched the way the lamplight collected on his hair, the slight whiteness that had crept into his temples. I traced in my mind all the evenings where his announcements had been innocuous. "Your daughter called," he'd say, or "the neighbor's dog is tied up again." Those nights had been ordinary stitches in a blanket. This one felt like a seam cut open. After the dishes, he went to the hall to wind the clock. I stood in the doorway and watched the familiar motion, his fingers turning the key as if unlocking something that was always there. The hallway smelled of lemon oil and old books. On the sideboard, a small stack of letters lay tied with a faded ribbon. Letters I had not touched in years. They were addressed in different handwritings, some with his careful, angular script, some with the softer loop of a woman who had once written to him in another life. I could not know, in that moment, whether those letters were fragments of the secret his smile hinted at, or just remnants of our papered past. "I'll be back late," he told me, as if to reassure me or perhaps to distance me. He kissed my forehead with the practiced gentleness that had soothed fevers and mended bruised knees. I returned the kiss, because it would have been harder to refuse. The night he left, I stood in the doorway until the sound of his steps disappeared down the walk. The lamp in the dining room cast the long shape of the clock on the wall. I listened to the small things we keep as proof we are still the same people who shared a bed for decades. The kettle's faint hum somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator's low sigh, the soft creak of the front gate returning to its rest. When I closed the door, I found the bundle of letters heavier in my hands than when I touched them earlier. I had been thinking of the photograph on the mantel, the one taken in the summer when we had driven up north and he learned to steer a small boat. My hair was tangled by wind, my smile reckless. He insisted on the picture because he loved the way my mouth curved when I wasn't guarded. He kept that photograph in the place of honor in the living room, for reasons that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with how the world suddenly rearranged itself. I took it down and set it face down on the table. I did not know then that turning a photograph over would feel like turning a life. He came home in the small hours, smelling faintly of tobacco and a perfume whose name I did not know. He looked as if he had been carrying something for a long time, stooped slightly at the shoulders, hands in his pockets like a man trying to keep a secret from spilling. He did not go straight to bed. Instead, he made himself a cup of tea and sat in the armchair by the window, staring at the streetlight as if it were a stage light, waiting for an actor to deliver a cue. "You're home late," I said, because the clock had lost its small, nightly comfort and become complicit in whatever he carried. He gave me a smile that asked for patience. "I wanted you to meet her properly." "Meet who?" I said, because the word her was now a live wire between us. He looked at me then, and for a moment I saw a man who had grown used to a ghost. He told me, in measured sentences, about the concert he had attended. A small music hall downtown, where the light pooled like honey on the stage, and a woman sang, as if she had swallowed the whole of a life and hummed back its shape. He had seen her months before, he said, a voice among other voices, but that night, after the last applause, she had stayed behind. He and she had sat in a shadowed rows, two older people with hands that looked like someone had run a tiny map of lines across them, and they had spoken until the theater emptied. "She is called Lena," he said. She has been in the town for some time. She used to teach at the conservatory." He spoke quietly, as if there were rules in place for revealing private things. "She plays piano in the afternoons and looks after the younger students. She's lonely." I laughed then. It was a small, surprised sound that had the edges of something hysterical. "You brought home a lonely pianist?" The laugh trembled because my mind had, inevitably, moved into corners where loneliness is often the frosting on infidelity. Yet the man in front of me, my man with his habitual kindness, didn't look like someone who traded promises for late appointments. He looked like a man who had seen another soul that matched some long-absent chord. "She reminded me of your aunt," he said, and the way he said it rewired something in me. My aunt had died before I was married. She had a way with children and a laugh that fluttered like a curtain. If Lena resembled my aunt in ways that mattered, then perhaps the meeting was not a betrayal, but a mirror. He told me she had lost her husband some years prior and that the conservatory had shrunk. The students were fewer, the concerts less frequent. He said he had begun to take his coffee in the lobby and to linger after the concerts because her face stayed with him. He spoke of music the way one speaks of prayer, as if listening were a kind of reverence. I wanted to believe him because believing that a small, human compassion had moved him felt less like collapse than some other possibility that kept surfacing in my mind. "Tonight," he said, "I thought you might like to hear her. She has a way with old songs. They sounded like letters she read out loud." He pressed my hand. "She reminded me of reading to you when we couldn't sleep, long ago." There was a sweetness to his story that made me ache. I thought of all the nights he had read to me, his voice melting into the room like butter into warm bread. There was tenderness in the notion that he saw in another person an echo of our quiet rituals. At the same time, the something I could not name lodged itself at the base of my throat, a small prickling flint that refused to be soothed. "I'll go," I said, and the decision felt like something I owed to myself and to him. If he had found in this woman a ghost of our gentleness, perhaps meeting her would be like discovering a third hand in the loom, stitching soft threads into the same tapestry. That evening, I dressed in the sort of dress that sits kindly on the shoulders and admits the light. I pinned my hair back, the way I did at the age of 50 when I still worried about what I looked like in headlights. I walked with my husband to the car, noticing the way the street smelled of cut hedges and warm pavement. Inside the music hall, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of coffee and old varnish. The chandelier made small constellations on the ceiling. People murmured like a flock settling. When Lena came on stage, she moved like someone carrying a heavy coat of memory. She was slender, with hair the color of winter wheat, and hands that hesitated above the keys before falling into motion. Her smile, when she noticed us, was the kind that did not try to court attention. It was a light that recognized itself in an old window. She sang with an economy of gesture that made the songs feel as if they had been rediscovered in a drawer and pressed flat again. There was solemnity in how she turned every phrase into a particularized offering. Gentleness I recognized, and a gratitude that made the corners of his mouth tremble. There was no drama in the meeting, only the soft architecture of people connecting. On the drive home, he held my hand. The night was cool, but there was no rain, and I was glad for that. Glad that the world did not soften its edges for us with water that might suggest washing away. My chest still felt tight, a muscle learning how to breathe after a long hold. At home, he turned to me and said, simply, "She's like a letter from another life." I slept poorly, not because of imagined betrayals, but because my mind had decided to translate kindness into a calculus I could not yet balance. In the gray hours before dawn, I sat at the kitchen table with the letters that had been tied in a ribbon. I untied them then, with hands that moved slowly, reverent as if opening a small shrine. The letters were not addressed to me. Some bore my husband's name, some held no name at all. The paper smelled like dust and lemon oil. My thumb brushed over the loops and tails of handwriting that felt like fingerprints. One letter, near the bottom, bore a different hand entirely, rounded, confident, older than ours. When I unfolded it, the first line read, "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner." I read and reread that single sentence because it felt like the hinge the next act would swing on. I could not yet know what door it opened, but the house had already shifted. The 3 a.m. kettle sang like an accusation. I made tea because the ritual steadied my hands. When the water boiled, light gathered in the teapot's rim like a small halo, and I held the warmth between my palms as if it were a talisman. The letter I had read folded on the table like a small sleeping bird. Its edges were soft from being handled, and the ink had the smudged clarity of someone who had written in a hurry and then later smoothed the mistakes into the lines. The letter spoke in fragments, not of affairs or clandestine loves, but of a woman named Anne who had lived across town years ago. The kind of woman who kept a tidy garden and taught music to children who could not afford lessons. She had taught my husband as a boy, she wrote, and then later, when his father fell ill and the house became a place of sharp angles and quieter meals, she had offered a room. It made room for him, the letter said. It kept some things from being alone. The sentences were spare, careful. There was a humility in the confession that felt old-fashioned, like a person who kept their debts with the manners of another era. As the words threaded themselves around my memory, I saw suddenly our first apartment, a small, crooked place with a radiator that wheezed, curtains that had seen better shop displays, and a piano borrowed from a neighbor for the month we could afford it. I remembered nights we passed pennies at the grocer, and nights he held my hand under the table, because the news of a job hadn't come yet. I remembered how once, when the landlord came to tell us he would be raising the rent, he had gone without supper for a week to cover the difference. There had always been a frugality about him that felt at once noble and reckless. The more I read, the more the story unfurled like a map. Lena, it seemed, had been connected to Anne in ways that made sense only when threaded through the past. Anne had been a woman who kept an eye for small miracles, a kindly interloper who stepped in when life thinned and lent a hand. She had, apparently, done for him what asterisks do for footnotes, clarified what had been passed over. When his mother left town in a hurry and with harsh words, Anne had given him a place at her table. He had kept letters from her folded inside a pocket of his coat, the way one keeps small prayers. What startled me was not the presence of another person in his history. We all of us carry histories that come with other names, but the way he had kept those letters like relics. He had never burned them. Instead, he had tied them with a ribbon and placed them where I could find them, and perhaps unknowingly, where I might, some night, sit with their edges between my fingers and see the person behind the ink. I called him at noon because silence had become its own language and asked for the whole story. He told me about Anne's late afternoons, of the way she would play Chopin by a window and, during breaks, pick tidbits of conversation like flowers from a vase. He explained how after Anne passed, Lena, who had been a student and later a companion, had become keeper of that lineage. The quiet repository of small kindnesses that passed from one hand to another. She kept the music in tune, he said, and his voice was soft, as if the words themselves were fragile notes. I listened. I felt my pulse, regular and steady, like a metronome. The house around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my verdict. I felt ridiculous, girded in the strange armor of jealousy, when the truth was so ordinary. A woman had entered our life in fragments. One who taught, who mended, who folded herself around children like a shawl. The infinite ways grief collects itself in hands and the simple acts of keeping someone else warm felt like a moral geometry I had only glanced at. That afternoon, I wrote to Lena. The letter came out of me like something I had been holding in my mouth for years and then finally let fall. I wrote a simple note. It would be a pleasure to have tea with her, to hear more about the conservatory, and perhaps, I admitted, to understand the shape of the kindness that had threaded itself through our lives. I wrote that the house had room for stories, and that if she wished to hear ours, she would be welcome to sit. She replied with a small postcard the size of an afterthought. Tomorrow afternoon, it read, in her looping hand, 2:30. I'll bring the music. When she arrived the next day, the house felt smaller and more intimate, as if it had been waiting for a guest who belonged. Lena carried a small case of sheet music and wore a coat that smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. She moved like someone with a defined interior life, careful with doors, respectful of the edges of furniture. We sat at the kitchen table, and she poured tea with a practiced, almost ceremonial hand. We talked for hours. She told stories of students who had become teachers, of recitals where a young voice had first found its note, of a life that had not always been kind but had always made a place for art. She did not apologize for her connection to my husband. She did not need to. She spoke instead of Anne's hands at the piano, and the way a living room could become a conservatory for a child who had nowhere else to go. I found myself listening to the music in her voice rather than the words. When my husband returned home that evening, he carried a small box tucked under his arm, a collection of music Anna had compiled for the children she taught. He had kept it after Anna's death, he said, and now wished to pass it on. The gesture was simple and right, and in a way, beautifully like him. I watched Lena and him talk about a particular sonata, their voices going low with shared memory. The sight warmed me in a manner I did not expect. A feeling like finding a forgotten sweater folded perfectly in the back of a drawer. There are certain objects in a house that begin as furniture and over time become anchors. The mantel clock was one. The brass bowl for keys was another. He had always been particular about where things lived. Keys, he said, were to be honored. They opened doors, after all. He kept them in a small brass dish with a dent from when he dropped them once, and swore the house had thin rids of laughter inside its walls. On a Tuesday, while Lena and I were cataloging scraps of sheet music for a community recital, I found myself alone in the study. It was a small room lined with bookshelves, their spines in various states of repair. The desk was the sort of desk that remembered fingers, grooves softened by writing. I opened the top drawer to find a stack of envelopes. Not the letter heap I had looked at before, but less formal, postcards, and small, almost bureaucratic notices. Tucked behind a ledger, my hand brushed against something cold and metallic. It was a key. The key was not like the keys that jingled in the brass bowl. This one was heavy, the color of old penny, and had an ornate bow in the shape of a heart with a small flourish. It felt as if it belonged in a story. Beneath the loose floorboard where I found it, there was nothing but dust and the faint smell of polished wood. I pressed it into my palm like a found coin and felt the pulse of something secretive that had nothing to do with betrayal and everything to do with concealment. That night, I put the key on the kitchen table between the salt and the sugar. My husband looked at it with the same soft amusement he gave oddities. He had a way of making small mysteries feel less foreign. "You found it?" he asked. I nodded. He took a breath and told me, with a clarity that felt, in its way, like relief, that the key opened a small chest Anne had left after she passed. It had been hidden under the floorboards of her old sitting room, he said, the very room where he had first learned scales. She had entrusted him with its discovery years before she died. And in a moment of an unremarkable Monday, he had slipped the key into his pocket and had never quite known where to place it. "What's inside?" I asked, because the question dug at the small, curious part of me that wanted stories wrapped in brass. He smiled. "Memories, sheet music, a few photographs. A rosary someone misplaced once. It was more like a prayer box than a chest. I suppose I was worried you'd think I'd been keeping secrets. I didn't know how to give it back without making a fuss." It was the word fuss that changed everything. Somewhere in the tapestry of our marriage, fuss had been the thing we had learned to avoid. We were people who let small kindnesses go unannounced because we believed kindness should not be performative. He had kept the key because he thought the past was better left as a soft-edged thing that would warm the hands when needed, not a public display that required explanation. We opened the chest the next morning together. The hinges gave a small, country sigh. Inside were folded programs from concerts long gone, a pressed violet, a photograph of Anne with a young man in a suit who was clearly younger than my husband had been in the photo I knew. There were letters tied in a ribbon similar to the one on our sideboard. There was, wrapped in tissue paper as if protecting something fragile, a small locket with a faded portrait inside. It was not my husband's face, but rather a woman with a stern, kind mouth. As I touched the locket, the air in the room thickened with the past's presence, not as a threat, but as a material thing, like wool you could unravel and reknit into a different garment. We spent the afternoon reading the letters aloud. They spoke of borrowed coal when the winter came early, of a borrowed baby carriage left with a neighbor when furniture had to be sold. They spoke of gratitude and small, necessary deceits. The sort of white lies you tell to preserve a dignity when the world refuses to soften. It was there, in the margins of a letter, that I found the most honest confession. Anne had written of a child she had cared for, briefly, when the child's mother had been ill. She had not speak of the child's name, only that the child had a laugh like the creek behind the schoolyard and a habit of tapping restless fingers on windowsills. The handwriting grew hurried in the lines where she confessed a shame that seemed too tender for the page. "I kept him safer," she wrote, "and maybe I kept him from knowing his other life." The sentence was a puzzle piece that did not fit neatly with anything I knew. As evening drew near, my husband quietly suggested that perhaps the child had been someone my husband had once protected. He looked at me with eyes that were earnest and a little fearful. "There are pieces of life," he said finally, "that we tuck into boxes because we cannot bear to burn them. They are not always mine to show." What followed after that were long talks, not arguments, but conversations that wound around each other like vines. We talked about faithfulness in ways that had nothing to do with bodies and everything to do with integrity. We spoke of the kind of fidelity that involves telling the truth, even when doing so will break the line of what you thought you were. I did not need him to be perfect. I needed him to be honest. It felt like a strange request, but it was the simplest currency I could imagine asking for. Later that week, Lena found a photograph tucked inside the chest, a picture of a small boy with my husband's eyes, jaw more delicate, smile shy. He had been wearing a cap too big for his head. The back of the photograph bore a single line, "To Anne, for holding him when he needed hands." We sat around the kitchen table with the photograph between us like a relic. The living room clock ticked with its small, patient insistence. The house felt as if it had been a fold in time, and someone had unfolded it to show us the inside seams. There was a hush, like the one that falls when a theater goes dark just before the curtain rises. My husband looked as if the world had become both bigger and smaller all at once. It is a strange thing to hold two images of a life in your hands and to watch how they refuse to merge. There was my husband, always steady, like a bookend on the shelf. And then the boy in the photograph, a face that had a sweeping arc of resemblance to my husband, but with softer edges, as if someone had redrawn the lines. His smile was particular, not wide, but certain. He had my husband's eyes and Anne's kindness, I thought. I do not know why I tried to locate every fault I might lay at someone's feet. It is as if, in trauma, our imaginations take direction like compasses, wild with needle. We found, after days of combing through letters and programs, the name of the boy. Thomas. A small entry in a conservatory ledger mentioned a scholarship given to a T. Marlowe for evening lessons. I recognized my husband's handwriting in the margin, the way he had annotated the ledger with tiny hearts and reminders to pick up milk. The ledger was a ledger of small things that had always been his domain, to-do lists like liturgies, receipts that bared his quiet care. When I asked him about Thomas directly, at first he hesitated. I had watched him for decades, seen the way his face smoothed into patience when he was asked to recall things. But there are corners of lives that we turn out the lights on, and his shoulders sagged in a way I had never seen. He told me slowly, like someone unspooling a tightly wound spool of thread, about an accident at the river when he had been 18. A neighbor's boy had fallen in while the current was high, and he had dove in without thinking because that was the kind of thing his hands did. Thomas had been found at the edge of the bank with water in his lungs but with a stubborn hold on life. He had been given to a nurse at the hospital, who, after the boy's parents failed to appear, had called Anne. She had taken him home and knit him sweaters and taught him to count music the way you teach a child to measure steps. My husband had visited when he could, giving what he had, a sandwich here, an extra coat there. He had written to keep the boy's numbers straight, piano lessons scheduled, the names of songs to practice. His handwriting, threaded through the boy's early scores like a ribbon. He was not mine, my husband said finally, and the confession landed like a small, honest stone at the bottom of the table. Not by law, but he came to us in a time when the world was unkind. I could not step away. The way he said it made no claims for heroics. It was a simple statement of fact. A life arrived in need, and he had stayed to help. He had not declared fatherhood. He had been a presence, a helper, a man who stood in the doorway with a pan and a smile. There was an ache at the back of his voice that needled me into clearer sight. It was a tenderness that had never tried to replace what the world did not provide, but tried to restore small parts of a life taken by circumstance. I thought then of my own life, how odd it was that we could love and not claim everything that love touched. How often had we stood at the edges of other people's needs and offered what we could. We were, in many ways, a couple who had a low tolerance for spectacle. We liked to do quiet things, repair a fence, brew a good pot of tea, help stitch a hem when a neighbor struggled. What we had not been, apparently, was dramatic enough to make public everything we had done for others. The boy Thomas, as it turned out, had grown into a man who left town at 22. He had, it seemed, been a wanderer of sorts, the sort of man who collects jobs like stamps and changes addresses like countries of residence. We found in one of Anne's letters that when he left, he had promised to return to play at the conservatory one day. He had left without notice, his signature as quick as a leaf. The discovery of Thomas's trajectory unsettled me. There was a hollow place where questions sprouted. Why did my husband keep these things hidden? Why had Anne left notes that could be misread? And what exactly did the presence of another person in his past mean for the quiet life we had built like a house of modest rooms and few visitors? When Thomas returned to town, as he did after 10 years away, because a letter came through a different hand, and because someone somewhere had decided it was time. The reunion was not the melodrama people write songs about. He was older, with stubble and eyes that had seen a lot of sky. He had the habit of looking at people as if trying to place them among a collection of memories. We met him on a Sunday afternoon when the conservatory held a small recital for local students. He sat in the back, hands folded like he was counting off a hymn. After the concert, we drank coffee in the lobby with Thomas and learned the curated gloss of a life on the road. Poor summer jobs, a stint in a kitchen where his hands learned the rhythm of knives. A few months at a theater. He spoke of a woman who had once kept his letters in a shoebox, and of a place near the river where he had learned how to find stones that could skip 3 times if thrown just right. He told us he had always wanted to be near music for the sake of the company it keeps. "I never thought to call you mine," he said at one point, and the sentence was a sort of shock that did not wound so much as rearrange. He had not intended to be claimed. He had been held and then set free. He avoided the word father with a kind of modesty I found almost painful. He called my husband Mr. Harris with a boyish courtesy that felt like a relic itself. I watched them together and saw a new constellation, a boy who had been held by a woman who allowed him to breathe, a man who had been the periphery of that holding, but who had left an invisible thread that tethered him in small ways. I felt, oddly, less betrayed than humbled. There was a richness to the life my husband had lived, an embarrassment of tender choices, that made me reassess the ledger of his faults. The question of fidelity shifted, away from bodies and into a territory where fidelity meant being the person who shows up for another's life, even if it requires secrecy to protect the dignity of a child. That night, I took the photograph of Thomas and set it next to our wedding portrait. Side by side, they were 2 faces of a story I had not fully known how to read. The lamp's light pooled on the table like a small stage, and I imagined the lines of our lives as musical measures, each holding notes that sometimes did not belong to the measure next to them, but made the composition whole. Confession, I have come to realize, rarely looks like the dramatic unburdening you see in films. It usually begins at an ordinary table with a cup of tea that grows cold while sentences are arranged like careful china. We were sitting around that very table when my husband began to speak in the slow, halting way of a man whose language had long been used for gentler things. "I never told you because I thought it would be painful," he said. "I thought if I kept it small, it would stay harmless. I wanted to protect you." He looked at me then, and there was a tremor in his voice, like a violin string. "I didn't know how to tell you that I had been a part of keeping Thomas safe." "You could have told me," I said, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because truth has a way of making things breathe. He took a breath and went on, detailing the nights he had sat by Thomas's bedside in the hospital, the times he had walked home after odd jobs with pockets full of coins for lessons. He told me about the day Thomas left, and how he had found a letter unsigned at the back of a drawer. "Forgive me," it said. It had been Anne's word to the world, small residue of sorrow left for future hands to discover. As he spoke, I thought of the many small ways we had built our life. The coat rack by the door that held 3 jackets instead of 2 because he had once sheltered a man in need. The extra loaf of bread in the freezer he never told me about because he thought it would worry me that we were less secure than our outward appearance. I realized then that our marriage had been stitched with acts, both visible and hidden, steadfast kindnesses that sometimes required secrecy to avoid making others feel lesser. The admission did not feel like a fracture so much as a revelation of a depth previously unseen. It opened the possibility that even the most honest life contains chambers we cannot access without permission. I had thought the trail would arrive like a storm, loud and indelible. Instead, it had come as a quiet reconsideration, a redistribution of where love had been given. We drank our tea until it cooled and then broke into stale biscuits. The house hummed around us, ordinary and oblivious. My husband's hands were those I had learned to read over the years. They could steady a jar lid or untangle a bird's nest of string. He put his hand over mine and said he had been afraid of how the fact of another life would change me. I was ashamed, he confessed, the words soft, as if it might bruise. Shame is a heavy thing. It anchors even the best-intentioned gestures. He had kept things from me because he believed concealment was a service to the dignity of a child and to the quiet life we had constructed. He had been thinking in terms that involved fewer people, a smaller stage. His fear of making things larger had paradoxically made everything smaller. When Thomas came to our house alone one Saturday, it was to ask an ordinary favor, to borrow a chair for a gig in a local hall. He was a man with a guitar case now, calloused fingers, the faint aroma of motor oil and coffee on his sleeves. He greeted us both with a familiarity that suggested his boyhood had been held by many hands. After some time, as the supper plates cooled, he pulled out a small envelope. "I found this," he said. Inside was a letter he had written years before and never mailed, addressed to Mrs. Harris. In it he had written, clumsy and sincere, "Thank you for keeping me safe." We read the letter together. It was not a document of legal claims, but a small offering of gratitude that felt like a benediction. He had been carrying appreciation like a small stone in his pocket all these years, shaped by the rubbing of his jeans. It was less of a resolution than a seal placed on something already mending. In the months that followed, an odd domestic choreography evolved. We began to fold Thomas into the edges of our days in ways that felt fittingly small. He would perform at the local hall, and we would sit in the front row like proud, somewhat embarrassed relatives. He would drop by with a new song recorded on a phone and eat cold pies with us afterward. Lena came often, her presence a warm constancy. Sometimes on Sunday mornings, the 3 of us, my husband, Lena, and I, would walk to the market and argue about the best tomatoes as if we were an odd, contented committee of taste. More than once, I found myself thinking about the strange moral math of life. We imagine that only transgressions warrant secrecy, but there is also the privacy of compassion, the decision to preserve someone's dignity by keeping certain things unremarked. I saw in a new light how my husband's secrecy had been less an act of betrayal and more an act of protection. The logic felt uncannily simple. He had chosen small lies or omissions so that a child might not feel manufactured or indebted in a way that scars. There were still awkward notes, times when Thomas would say something that made me flinch because it suggested he had imagined the world differently. But in those moments, we would sit and talk and the edges would smooth. His presence made the house noisier in a good way. There was a liveliness to the clink of dishes when he stayed for dinner, and a richness to the music that floated through the rooms. At night, after guests left and the house settled like a patient animal, we would sit by the window and listen to the sleeping town. My husband would wind the clock as he had done every evening for years. and I would rest my head on his shoulder in the small domestic contentment that had been both our bedrock and our slow transformation. Life has an odd habit of rearranging itself in increments so small you only notice by cataloging the differences. Our days took on a new rhythm: morning practice at the conservatory, afternoons where Lena taught and Thomas sound-checked at odd hours, evenings when my husband and I would sit with the radio and listen to a program that dealt in obituaries and obscure vinyl. We were older then, yes, but age felt less like a curtailing force and more like a kind of concentration that distilled what mattered. There came the Sunday, the year after Thomas returned, when he invited us to a small gig at a hall across town. The hall was built of bricks that remembered coal and had a stage that sagged a little in the center, the way old sofas do when truly loved. Thomas played songs he had written that were stitched with small narratives: a man who kept clocks for a living, a woman who mended gloves at the bus stop, a child who counted the time between trains. There was never a moment of showmanship. His music was the kind of offering that asked only to be heard. Lena sat at the back with a face the color of someone who was trying to memorize each phrase. At the end of the set, Thomas dedicated a song to the ones who taught me to turn up. He looked at my husband and then at me and said, as if answering a small prayer, "This is for the people who kept me from sinking." The audience, made up of a few locals and relatives and some students from the conservatory, clapped with the considerate kind of applause small towns honor. I felt my throat close with something like gratitude that had been washed clean by time. Afterward, people drifted to the back room for tea and lukewarm sandwiches. Conversations overlapped, a pleasant domestic noise. My husband and I sat in a corner, and he took my hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, and there was a weight to his words, a smallness that made them larger than they might have been in a different season. There was no grand apology, no dramatic confession, only the honest gratitude of two people who had done their best with what they had and now saw, with intensified clarity, the shape of those efforts. In time, Thomas became a fixture. He would drop by on a Friday and help mend a shelf or cut the hedges with a care that seemed almost ceremonial. Lena taught a group of children who could not afford private lessons and sometimes used our living room for practice. We shifted, unobtrusively, into a community that hugged close. The town, which had always been a cluster of people who shared tools and cakes, accepted him the way it accepted other wayward sons and daughters, with a mixture of fondness and bemused practicalities. My husband aged with a slowness that felt like mercy. That is to say, he did not vanish into infirmity in the way some of our neighbors had. Instead, he became what he always was: a man with a steady hand who intended to fix things. He developed a cough that worried Lena, who insisted he see a doctor more often than he preferred. I watched him with the careful attention of someone cataloging a rare bird in the wild. There were nights when he would hold my hand, and we would speak of an ordinary future with contentment, garden plans, the idea of a long trip to the coast that we would perhaps one day take. One autumn, when the light cut the lawns into crisp plains and the conservatory staged an end-of-season recital, my husband collapsed one afternoon while we were cutting roses. It was sudden and terrifying, a small avalanche of white and sound. We called an ambulance, and the days that followed were made of hospital rooms and the antiseptic smell of things sterilized beyond memory. He came home with a note and a residency of convalescence. It was in these long, quiet days after his return that the full geometry of our life rearranged itself once more. Thomas, who had been a regular at our meals by then, began to stay overnight more often, his guitar case leaning against the wall like a loyal dog. Lena arrived daily with soup and recorded lessons on a thumb drive for my husband to play while he rested. The house, which had often been orderly, became a place where mess signified presence. A cup left by the sink, a script folded on the table, music sheets splayed like casual confessions. As my husband convalesced, we made small adjustments that felt profound. We moved the armchair by the window, so he could catch the afternoon light. The way someone rearranges a room to make it more hospitable for an old friend. I found, to my surprise, that domestic care was a kind of grace, a way of holding my own breath for another person. I became his nurse and his fellow conspirator in small mischiefs, like how we would hide the television remote to make him read aloud from the books on the shelf. One evening, as he slept with his hand folded over the blanket like a small anchor, Lena sat with me in the kitchen and spoke softly about music and memory. "He taught me how to count," she said, and there was a hush, as if speaking of those formative things required tenderness. "He would keep me company when I needed the light on." Her voice contained a gratitude that was neither theatrical nor apologetic. It was simply an accounting of what had been given and what had been received. There is a dignity in such exchanges that movies cannot depict, the gentle choreography of care, the small rituals that take the place of scale. I came to understand that loyalty takes forms other than the dramatic. It could be the man who keeps the heating bill paid for a neighbor, or the woman who teaches a child to hold a bow correctly. Love, I decided, was a ledger of small entries that, when added up, created surprising balances. The last months were a study in quiet heroics. My husband became smaller in ways that made him more luminous to me. He learned to be content with brief sentences and the slow pleasure of pages turned. He loved tea that was too weak and insisted on sitting by the window, where the light fell into the same patch every afternoon, like a ritual lamp. I learned to read his breathing as if it were a score, the inhalation, the soft pause, the exhalation. In that rhythm, I found a kind of music that none of us had anticipated. One night, he called Thomas and Lena to the house. There was no dramatic flourish, just the ordinary arrangement of chairs and a small cake with a single candle. He wanted, he said simply, to be surrounded by the people who had kept him from sinking. He wanted to say thank you and to hear their voices in the small room that had held them for so long. We ate cake with knives not well suited for the job and laughed about the conservatory's oddest students and the time a cat had wandered into a lesson and refused to leave. Later, my husband took my hand, and for a breathless second, I saw again the young man who had once stood at a lectern he could not afford and read aloud because he thought stories might make the world better. He looked at me with a simple gratitude that belonged to neither apology nor regret. "I'm glad you let me keep some things," he said. And there was no defensiveness, only a quiet appreciation for a life that had contained small, unshown kindnesses. He died with his hand in mine. The day was ordinary, a thin light, the scent of warm bread from the oven. And his final breath was soft, as if a story had closed its cover and left a small silence. There were no dramatic words, no last-minute revelations, only an ending that was the kind of gentle departure we had fantasized about in youth, a sleep that led to rest. Afterwards, as we dismantled the little world of family care, Lena and Thomas and I moved through grief like people unpacking boxes with hands still trained in the work of tenderness. In the months that followed, the house became a different sort of room. Photographs were reorganized, and the brass bowl for keys sat like a fossil of a habit. I would find myself, at odd intervals, winding the clock in the hallway because the motion had become ritual in the absence of his arms. Thomas played at the conservatory more often, and Lena began a small scholarship in Anne's and my husband's names for children who needed lessons. They curated a concert one summer titled Letters and Hands, songs stitched from the chest we had opened that first week. The town turned up as towns do, a slow, insistent continuity that held us gently. On the first anniversary of his death, I walked to the conservatory when a small group gathered to listen to Thomas play. The hall smelled of varnish and the green of fresh spruce boughs someone had left by the door. He dedicated a piece to my husband, and then, in the quiet that followed, asked if I would say a few words. I did, because what else do you do when a life needs to be named? I spoke about the smallness of kindness and the way a life's tally is not found in a single act, but in a series of tiny mercies. Afterwards, as people milled about and tea cooled on saucers, a woman approached me with a photograph in her hand. She was younger, perhaps in her 40s, with a face that held an earlier echo of the boy in the old picture. She introduced herself as Martha. "I was Thomas's neighbor," she said. "He told me about a man who paid for lessons and kept a box of music. He called him my other teacher sometimes. He wanted me to give this to you." She handed me a small envelope with a single line written across it, "For keeping us all from sinking." Inside was a short note, Thomas's handwriting now steady and mature. "Thank you for letting me have more than one home," it read. "For the people who kept me, you were always gracious enough to include them in your hospitality." I felt a warmth then that was not the heat of old grief, but the warmth of an ember that had been fed carefully. When I returned home that evening, I took down the photograph from the mantel and placed it next to the wedding portrait. I did not position them as rivals, but as a small constellation, different lights that together made the room more luminous. I wound the clock and listened as it ticked the way it always had. A steady, ordinary insistence that time, at least, moves forward. I began, in the quiet that followed, to write. Not letters to the dead, but notes to myself. Instructions for living a life that held small mercies. I wrote about kindnesses in the margins and how to keep them from being performative. I wrote about how young people sometimes need quiet guardianship and how the dignity of secrecy can be an act of mercy rather than a betrayal. The pages formed in my hands a small manual for being ordinary and generous. In the end, the woman I met that night at the music hall had not been the fissure in our marriage I had feared. She had been a mirror and a bridge. She had connected threads that had always existed but had been knotted in private. She had been, in her small and patient way, one of the people who showed up when the world could not be trusted to be kind. My husband's smile, on the night he had told me I would meet her, had been the beginning of a rearrangement, not the unpicking of a life, but its enlargement. The house remains full of the echoes of ordinary music and ordinary grief. The clock still keeps time, and the brass bowl still holds keys of various sizes, including that small, ornate key we discovered beneath the floorboard. Sometimes, when the light hits the mantel in the right way, I can see the photograph of Thomas and think of the ways life folds people into each other like pages. I have learned that fidelity of self is not what you keep secret, but what you prove with the small, daily accounts. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.